We usually don't get this many people for a flute concert. Jeremy made this flute, and it's a gift for Bob. So my name's Tom Gibeon, and is that applause for me? So I've had the honor of working with Bob Hoag for the last 9 years. We kind of had a thing going about who would leave first. Thank you, Bob. I'm going to be very brief because we have two introductions, Dave Kahn and Eduardo Pallone. Have you guys decided who's first? Dave Kahn? Okay, so it's not possible to have just one, iconic teacher. They come in 3s and 4s. And so Dave Kahn, please welcome.
I don't use the words talented, great, or genius very often. I just thought I'd say that. I remember I would walk by and see Bob in the classroom, and a poem by the English Romantic poet John Keats would often come to mind. I can't remember which poem, but it was one of his better ones. But enough of the sentimental stuff. Let's get to the business at hand. Soon, Eduardo is going to tell you about Wikipedia Bob. I'm here to tell you about Dark Web Bob. I didn't know Bob in his youth, so I went back to his old neighborhood in Baltimore to learn what I could about his early years. I asked his 2nd grade teacher. She didn't remember Bob. I talked to his 8th grade teacher. She didn't remember Bob. I talked to some high school teachers. They didn't remember Bob. As a last resort, I checked with Bob's mother. She remembers Bob, but she couldn't remember Bob's father. See, Deb, I told you'd be okay. Bob's college years were like many of ours at the time, long and drawn out, and probably not suitable for this audience. Suffice it to say, he was a wolf in cheap clothing. Bob pulled himself together and spent time after his 2nd junior year in the higher echelons of student government at Frostburg University. He tells the story about crashing into Hubert Humphrey in a campus men's room one time. He tells the story, too, about standing next to the urinal right next to tennis star Boris Becker at the DC Tennis Open. It's pretty clear that Bob has spent a lot of time meeting men, strangers, in public restrooms. Though I don't know that his stance is a wide one. That's an historical reference only some of you will get. Fortunately for him, Bob's chosen field was history. History never changes. The War of 1812 will always be fought in 1812. Napoleon will always make the mistake of advancing into Russia in winter. The North will always win the Civil War. These unchanging facts of history have allowed Bob to keep teaching for 40 years. Up until now, when he is so clearly but a shell of his former self. Which is one reason, by the way, that teaching history is so much easier than teaching English. History doesn't change. You can tell the same joke year after year after year, unlike English, where every class has to be fresh and new and bright. But I lose myself. It's no secret that Bob is getting older. We all are. He's just showing it a little more. The Hoax were over at our place for dinner a while ago. He and I were in the kitchen cleaning up after the meal. See, Deb? Again. We're in the kitchen cleaning up after the meal. He was wearing a pretty snazzy shirt. And I can use all the snazzy I can get these days, so ask him where he got it. He smacked his head a couple of times. Oh man, he says, what's the name of that famous baseball player from Baltimore? You mean Cal Ripken? No, the older. You mean Brooks Robinson? No, way older. The guy who was born in Baltimore. There's a museum up there. You mean Babe Ruth? Yeah, that's it, Ruth, where'd I get this shirt? Bob came to Sandy Spring in 1979. Some who know this history might say, in a way, the low point in the school's existence. I imply no connection between those two events. Since that year, since 1979, when he began teaching, I believe the school has been on an upward track. I imply no connection between those two events either. The truth is, though, that if Sandy Spring Friends School were a country, and thank God it's not, its first set of postage stamps would show pictures of Barry and Ann Morley. The next stamps probably Ari Preuss. Its most recent commemorative issues would have Bob on them. Taking a Bob class is something that connects classes of the 80s, the 90s, and today. Remember when Bob told the story about, or when he told Nathan to? The fact is, the school will be a different place next year when Bob is gone, but it's a different place because he's been here for some 40 years. So clearly a better place. So now that you'll have all this free time, Bob, just stay out of men's rooms.
Good evening, friends, and welcome to Cheers to 40 Years, a retirement celebration to honor Bob Hoke. For those whom I haven't had the pleasure of meeting, my name is Eduardo Polon, and among other things, I serve as head of the Upper School's Global Languages Department, teach Spanish language and culture at the advanced levels, and coach our interscholastic academic team, a program Bob himself founded in the fall of 1983. Now, I met Bob shortly after I turned 25. That was 24 years ago, what has since amounted to the second half of my life. 23 years ago, I taught his eldest son, John, and last year, he taught my daughter, Alex. Along the way, this mentor became my dear friend. So what a weighty privilege it is for me to introduce our guest of honor this evening. As I look out from the stage to a packed house, I have a very real sense what the band Floating Bridge. Remember them? Me neither. Anyway, I have a real sense what Floating Bridge must have felt like on December 27, 1968, opening for Led Zeppelin at the Seattle Center Arena, as rock gods Robert Plant, Jimmy Page, John Paul Jones, and John Bonham descended on the United States to embark on their first North American concert tour. In other words, thank you for your patience and for tolerating this warm-up act whom you didn't come to see. Like any self-aware opener, I have a few key objectives. Number 1, warm you up. 2, set the stage. And 3, make way for tonight's headliner. So with your understanding, and before he takes the stage to give his final lecture, please indulge me these next 10 minutes as I attempt to do my best Ken Burns historical documentarian impersonation by paying tribute to Bob in honor of 40 years of service to Sandy Spring Friends School. Bob Hoke's devotion to Sandy Spring over the past 40 years has not only cemented a beloved legacy intertwined with the school's cherished motto and wisdom of George Fox's "Let Your Lives Speak," but epitomizes the Quaker testimonies. Martin Luther King Jr. said, "We are not makers of history, we are made by history." To help understand a person's moral compass, learn who their heroes are. Not surprisingly, Bobby Kennedy and Eugene Debs shed light on the important role that peace, integrity, and equality play in defining Bob's character. Bob worked for the RFK for President campaign in 1968, helping run the campaign office in Cumberland, Maryland. Around 20 years old, Bob liked Kennedy's views on ending the Vietnam War and his commitment to civil rights, and was inspired by Bobby's famous words. Some men see things as they are and ask why. I dream of things that never were, and ask why not. Eugene Debs was a turn of the 20th century labor leader who became the face of the Socialist Party for years. From leading strikes and helping found unions, Debs constantly worked to make things better for the laborer and ran repeatedly for president, to no avail. Arrested during World War I for urging workers to question America's role in the war, and later convicted for violating the Sedition Act, Debs' sentence was 10 years in prison. At the sentencing, Debs told the judge, "Your Honor, years ago I recognized my kinship with all living beings, and I made up my mind that I was not one bit better than the meanest being on earth. I said then, and I say now, that while there is a lower class, I am in it. And while there is a criminal element, I am of it. And while there is a soul in prison, I am not free." A man of unwavering integrity and for whom the importance of equality resonates profoundly, both the times and the ways in which Bob began truly to let his life speak point to the origins of what would help shape this great historian and teacher. You see, Bob was an anti-war activist during Vietnam, a part of numerous demonstrations, including the 1967 March on Washington that Norman Mailer made famous in his book Armies of the Ninth. With regard to civil rights, Bob's own Baltimore High School did not integrate until the year after he graduated. At college, Bob was part of a group that demonstrated against the Tau Kappa Epsilon fraternity's minstrel show that forced Frostburg State University to ban blackface moving forward. As president of the student body, Bob brought civil rights activist Dick Gregory and Chicago 7 anti-war activist Renee Davis to speak at the college. When a bill was introduced in the Maryland Assembly to make student fees optional, Bob testified against it because it was aimed at preventing students from bringing in radical speakers. In 1972, Bob ran for mayor of Frostburg to challenge a law that stated you had to own $2,000 worth of property to run for office. This resulted in a legal challenge that made it all the way to the Maryland Supreme Court and won. The largest turnout in Frostburg's history showed up on election day to prevent Bob, the hippie hope, from winning. Bob has not only helped champion civil rights and social change himself, he has inspired student activism in his Native American history class to speak with representatives on the Hill and push for legislation in support of American Indian rights. Who better than Bob to be cast as Henry Drummond, a role based on eloquent defense attorney Clarence Darrow in SSFS's rendition in 2002 of Inherit the Wind, a slightly fictionalized account of the Scopes monkey trial of the 1920s. How perfect to see Bob take the stage and proclaim, "Yes, the individual human mind. In a child's ability to master the multiplication table, there is more holiness than all your shouted hosannas and holy holies. An idea is more important than a monument, and the advancement of man's knowledge more miraculous than all the sticks turned to snakes and the parting of the waters." Long before it became fashionable, in proving him a teacher by his example as much as his lessons, Bob's "Live Simply so that others may live" lifestyle exemplifies simplicity and includes the choice to forego certain conveniences deemed unnecessary, like air conditioning, a microwave, and a dishwasher, Similarly, the preservation of his 1890 farmhouse, coupled with his meticulous tending of gardens, both fruit and vegetable, and the raising of chickens, promote a self-sustaining and organic lifestyle that currently yields more than 60% of their food needs. Add to this the practice of traditional Native American gardening techniques like the Three Sisters growing method, as well as the inclusion of heirloom seeds from Thomas Jefferson's gardens at Monticello and heritage plantings from Johnny Appleseed, and it's clear that Bob serves as an example par excellence of stewardship in this environmentally fragile time. If the times shaped his character and tested his authenticity, it was in the classroom where Bob's reputation as an inspired and inspiring, encyclopedic and wise, riveting and jocular educator was forged. Progressive-minded, yet skeptical of fleeting gimmicks, who better than a historian to understand that experience is the best teacher? Deeply rooted to teaching and synonymous with SSFS for cross-generations of students, alumni, and parents, Bob's 4 decades of service to this community defy the ephemeral trends of time and place that make up the transient Washington metropolitan area. To put this in perspective, and by conservative measures, Bob has taught some 2,400 students, counseled about 900 college applicants, guided nearly 470 travelers on intersessions, mentored around 350 advisees, and coached approximately 300 athletes in both basketball and soccer. Preciously, Bob's tenure has afforded him the rare gift of having taught the children of former students, a remarkable legacy and testament to his devotion to Sandy Spring Friends School. Yet Bob has helped shape SSFS history far beyond his classroom. Here are just a few shining examples that may surprise those without the institutional memory. The basketball program. When the Potomac Valley Athletic Conference was formed, member schools had to participate in a certain number of sports to be in compliance. In November 1981, Bob, alongside Barry Merritt, assembled the first SSFS men's varsity basketball team. Built practically out of thin air, SSFS didn't even have a gym at the time. There was a single basket in Clifton and an outdoor court at the far end of the old tennis courts where the Performing Arts Center sits today. Together, Bob and Barry rented an old gym in Clarksville, and every match was an away game. After the Horning gym was built, Bob passed the reins of the varsity team to Darrell Becker in order to start a middle school team. Ultimately, basketball grew and flourished into what is today a signature athletics program. The College Guidance Program. Results of Sandy Spring Friends School's first AIMS accreditation process, supported by a survey of recent graduates, revealed that our college advising process was not a strength at the time. In 1986, alongside former registrar Francis Lambert, Bob designed and implemented the SSFS College Guidance Program that included the creation of a college guidance office with Bob as director and Francis as assistant director. Curriculum development. Prior to 1988, there were zero advanced placement classes at Sandy Spring Friends School, and our seniors were at a disadvantage when competing with other schools in the college process. There needed to be another measuring stick for college admission offices to evaluate our students. Together, Bob and David Kahn started the AP program at SSFS by offering AP US History and AP Literature, and within a few years, all the other departments followed suit. In addition, among the curriculum development programs at SSFS of which Bob is most proud is the creation and implementation of Native American history. Transcending the usual aspects of a more traditional history course, the class evolved into an awareness campaign, advocacy group, and service learning opportunity. For example, Bob took his students multiple times to lobby Congress on behalf of American Indian rights. Bob and his students met with Chris Van Hollen when he was first elected to Congress, urging him to support various pending measures like federal recognition for 4 Virginia tribes, more funding for the Indian Health Service, and broadband accessibility on reservations. His class also met with the late Senator Inouye when he was the chairman of the Senate Indian Affairs Committee about having the government return sacred remains to the appropriate tribes. Bob also raised money for specific programs, like Unity Hoops, an innovative initiative founded by inspired alum David Dean of the class of 2009 that integrates social justice-centered education with the game of basketball to empower Native youth to excel academically and become change makers in their community. Furthermore, Bob was instrumental in bringing to campus the deputy director of the National Congress of American Indians, the oldest and largest national tribal government advocacy organization in the country, and Pulitzer Prize nominee Donna Britt, to draw parallels to the issue of offensive words and images during the civil rights movement. This led to the student body choosing to ban the use of the offensive name of Washington's NFL team. Quote, "In recognition of the ethical stand taken supporting respect for American Indians," close quote, the Baltimore Yearly Meeting Indian Affairs Committee commended the Sandy Spring Friends School community for its consciousness-raising effort to stop the unthinking and casual use of the R word. American biographer, historian, and political commentator Doris Kearns Goodwin said of herself, "I am a historian. With the exception of being a wife and mother, it is who I am, and there is nothing I take more seriously." Similarly, Bob is a teacher, an extraordinary one at that. With the exception of being a husband and father, it is who he is. The truth is that at any school, there are teachers, and there are those that make a place what it is, who truly are the school. Many teach. Bob inspires. Over these past 40 years, Bob has become an embodiment of our school's motto, "Let your life speak." Consequently, he has himself become a cherished institution within our cherished institution. Atop the pantheon of all-time great teachers at SSFS, Bob's carved into our faculty's Mount Rushmore. In the end, I hold dear the quote, "The treasure of a life is a measure of love and respect. The way you live, the gifts that you give. In the fullness of time, it's the only return that you expect." Accordingly, it is with tremendous love and the utmost respect that I have the privilege to thank Bob on behalf of Sandy Spring Friends School. But none more so than the thousands of fortunate students who have passed through here during the past 40 years. To our colleague and friend Bob Hope, I close this tribute the same way he lovingly closed each of his lessons. Go and sin no more. But before he does, please join me in welcoming to the stage for his last lecture, tonight's guest of honor, the palindrome we're all gathered here to celebrate, whom, not unlike Cher, Prince, Madonna, Bono, Beyonce, Sting, Pelé, and Messi, is recognizable to us all by just one name: Bob.
All right, that's enough. As I've often started many classes, sit down and shut up. Well, let me start by thanking David for not allowing me to get a big head about any of this. And let me thank Eduardo for making me sound way more interesting than I really am. I've been asked over the years, what is your favorite era? What event? What do you like to teach? What excites you? What do you look forward to teaching? And it's really hard to come up with an answer to that. So tonight I chose to talk about the year 1968. I thought I always enjoy teaching about something that I lived through, that I saw. Now I know my baby sister's here tonight and she's thinking, well hell, that's anything from the Civil War on. But we know how that turned out. So 1968, none of my students are old enough to remember 1968. And those of you that are old enough to remember 1968 probably don't remember 1968. So I thought I'd do a little refresher class on the year things fell apart. Let me sort of set the stage for 1968. Prior to 1968, the country was roiling in discontent. From 1963 to 1968, the number of assassinations that had taken place. Medgar Evers was killed in Mississippi. Malcolm X was killed. President Kennedy was assassinated in Dallas. Ngo Diem, the head of our supposed ally South Vietnam, was murdered by his own military. The civil rights movement was fracturing into Dr. King and those that were more aggressive in terms of being tired of waiting for civil rights. So let me begin there. As the year began, the Tet Offensive broke out in Vietnam. President Johnson had told us that the war would be over by next Christmas, that we were getting ready to withdraw troops, we were winning the war. And then in January of 1968, on the Vietnamese New Year celebration, the combined forces of the Viet Cong and the North Vietnamese regulars completely overwhelmed the American forces. Now, the Tet Offensive ultimately failed. It was beaten back, but at an enormous cost to American lives and Vietnamese lives as well. So, what had been a smaller anti-war movement after Tet became a major movement. People like Walter Cronkite, who was considered a god by the American people, came out against the war. Senator Eugene McCarthy, in February of that year, decided to challenge President Johnson in the New Hampshire primary. Well, this is a bold move for a senator from Minnesota. No sitting president had ever been denied the nomination. And those of a certain age, which is my age, meant that what you did is it was called get clean for Gene. All right, you tied your hair back, hid it behind you, and went and knocked on doors in New Hampshire in support of Senator McCarthy's nomination. Well, he didn't win, but he received 42% of the vote, which was the largest percentage of any candidate against the sitting president. So the message was clearly there. And then Andy Warhol, who was the epitome of the 60s, Andy Warhol was shot. He was shot by Valerie Solanas, a radical feminist and founder of an organization called SCUM, S-C-U-M. It stands for the Society for Cutting Up Men. Andy Warhol was declared dead, but 10 minutes later was revived and went on, but was really not the same person after that attempt. And then, to the surprise of everyone, Lyndon Johnson announced that he would not seek re-election. It is incredibly unusual for a sitting president not to seek re-election. President Johnson said that he was going to devote his time to working out a peace in Vietnam. Well, when that started, Prague Spring broke out in Czechoslovakia. Alexander Dubček became the leader of Czechoslovakia, promoting what he called socialism with a human face. Everybody was sort of holding their breath to see what would happen. Khrushchev had been deposed in 1964, and the Soviet Union, every time a leader is deposed, they talk about, well, we're going to collective leadership. And so there emerged to be the combination of Brezhnev and Kosygin. Well, Brezhnev had pushed himself to the forefront, and the tanks were ordered into Czechoslovakia. And what happened then was something called the Brezhnev Doctrine, where the Soviet Union announced that they would use force to maintain the governments in all the Iron Curtain nations. On a lighter note, Arlo Guthrie released a 26-minute version of Alice's Restaurant. You can get anything you want at Alice's Restaurant. It detailed his run-in with the draft board and the state police in Massachusetts. In terms of film, 2001 Space Odyssey became the #1 film of 1968. Now, if you'll recall, those of you that went to see Space Odyssey, chemical-free, you remember Hal, the computer, the talking computer, how freaked out we were? Is Hal not the grandfather of Siri? I mean, clearly, there's a connection. But then things turn tragic again. In April, Dr. Martin Luther King goes to Memphis to mediate a garbage strike. While he was there, he was assassinated by James Earl Ray. The country exploded after the death of the man who preached nonviolence his whole life. I remember coming home from school that April and dropping off a friend. There were two of us from Baltimore and one from Washington, and we dropped the friend from Washington off. And the incredible image that's sort of seared in my mind of 50 caliber machine guns and barbed wire on the steps of the Capitol building. And then when we returned home, as we're coming through Baltimore, seeing the tanks in Patterson Park. It's at this point that Bobby Kennedy decides to enter the race for president, challenging Eugene McCarthy. In June of 1968, Bobby Kennedy had just won the California primary, which would be a huge step to gaining a nomination. But as he's leaving the hotel, Bobby Kennedy is assassinated by Sirhan Sirhan. Sirhan Sirhan was a Palestinian nationalist who was angry at Bobby Kennedy's support for selling arms to Israel. Now, as Eduardo mentioned, I worked in 1968 in the Cumberland office in the RFK for president. At that point, I was home, and I was elated. I had gone to bed with the knowledge that Bobby Kennedy had just won the California primary, only to have my mother wake me up the next morning and tell me that Bobby Kennedy had been shot. That summer at the Olympics, an iconic photograph, John Carlos and Tommy Smith raised their fists in a Black Power salute. They will be stripped of their medals. But I just want to point out something that a lot of people don't remember about this photograph, and that's the man in the middle. Maybe Tony knows who that is. Tony, you know who that is? No, okay. It's Peter Norman. He was an Australian sprinter. And he was wearing a button that supported something called the Olympic Project for Human Rights. When he returned home, he was ostracized for his support. And in 1972, despite his qualifying time, was not picked to be on the Australian Olympic team. Back to culture, the Beatles have the #1 song of 1968. All right, so all you musicologists out there, what was the #1 song of the Beatles in 1968? Do we have any ideas here? I Want to Hold Your Hand. Way too late. Way too late. They were past holding people's hands at that point. I heard it over here. Hey Jude. Yeah. The song was Hey Jude. All right. There's class participation points being awarded. Over here. All right. See me afterwards and you'll get your checky boxes. All right. Good. Okay, then in July, the Democratic Convention is held in Chicago. The Democratic Party was fractured. What a shock. So protesters descended on Chicago. And Chicago was overrun. Abby Hoffman, Jerry Rubin of the Youth International Party, YIP, also known as the Yippies. Bobby Seale was there for the Black Panthers. Tom Hayden for the Students for a Democratic Society was there. Rennie Davis, head of the anti-war movement. And again, let me just, a quick anecdote here. When I was in Sandy Spring, I was in charge of bringing in speakers, and I brought Rennie Davis to Frostburg to speak. He was followed by the FBI pretty much everywhere he went, and so it was a little shocking to me because he gave a speech and he decided, you know, I kind of like it up here. And so he lived with us for a week. Every morning, we would take coffee out to the FBI guys in front of my apartment. They're very nice. We were pretty happy to see him leave. Well, ultimately, Vice President Hubert Humphrey will be nominated by the Democratic Party. However, because of the demonstrations and Mayor Richard Daley unleashing the police and the National Guard, the riots, Humphrey could not give his acceptance speech until well after midnight. And most people don't really stay up to hear Hubert speak. Hubert Humphrey, again, those of you of a certain age, Hubert Humphrey liked to talk. And he would start out by saying, well, I'm just as pleased as punch to be here. And then for the next hour and a half, he would be pleased while the rest of us were not. Well, not everybody was happy with the Democratic Party. Governor George Wallace decided to run for the newly formed American Party. George Wallace was the segregationist governor of Alabama. And I'm sure many of you can remember the iconic picture of him standing in the doorway, blocking a 6-year-old girl from entering a school in Alabama. Well, to make things even more interesting, in August, former Vice President Richard Nixon is nominated by the Republican Party. Now, Nixon had lost in 1960. He ran for governor of California in 1962 and lost again, and gave his farewell speech saying, "You'll not have Richard Nixon to kick around anymore." Well, we did. The election results are as follows. I'm still depressed. The scariest part of this election is the number of votes that George Wallace received in 1968. So this then began the Nixon years. On a happier note, to end the year, in December, Apollo 8 was launched. I hear them calling now, actually. Our space program had been somewhat questionable. You know, after the Soviets launched Sputnik, shot down Gary Powers in the U-2, there was a feeling that, oh my God, we've fallen behind. The Apollo 8 is going to be the first, with Frank Borman, James Lovell, and William Anders, are going to orbit the moon and send back, and again, it's a stunning photograph of an Earthrise, which we hadn't seen before. Well, in 1969 then, you know, we have things that are coming. We set the stage. You know, there's going to be Woodstock. By 1972, there's going to be Watergate. We're going to put a man on the moon, and the nation moves forward. But for those of us that were alive in 1968, this was such a year of an incredible emotional highs and lows that it becomes seared into our collective memories. So I need to thank some people. First of all, let me thank Lauren Mossman and her group for putting this whole thing together. What an amazing amount of work that went into getting you all to come out here. And let me thank the Sandy Spring community, which I've been part of for 40 years, and have enjoyed the entire time. It was great to have such a community where, you know, my sons could go to school, where I actually got an opportunity to teach them. Although I'm sure Ian was actually drawing pictures and not actually taking notes. But, and to have my wife act as a volunteer, counseling parents on financial aid. I want to particularly thank my wife Ruth, who's for 46 years made this possible. Because without her, I'm not possible. So thank you all for coming. Go and sin no more. Lauren wants to remind you that there's food in the lobby. I'll be out there, and I look forward to talking to all of you. Thank you all for coming.